The bell above the door of the Dawn Diner in the heart of Boston was the persistent soundtrack of Mary Collins's life. It was not a cheerful chime, but rather a tired, metallic clanking that announced the arrival of yet another shivering customer in need of hot coffee, another plate of greasy eggs to carry, and another single-dollar bill for her to slip into the communal tip jar. The diner itself was a faded relic of a bygone era, a perfectly preserved time capsule featuring worn, mustard-colored vinyl booths, a permanently sticky linoleum floor, and a heavy, lingering aroma of burnt coffee beans and frying bacon. For 24-year-old Mary, this humble establishment was simultaneously her daily prison and her only sanctuary against the unforgiving cold of the city. For the past 3 years, working 6 days a week from 5:30 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, she had flawlessly performed the familiar, exhausting ballet of an experienced waitress. She navigated the impossibly narrow aisles with a grace born of endless repetition, balancing dangerously heavy plates along her forearm, refilling thick ceramic mugs without spilling a single drop, and manufacturing a polite, welcoming smile that often felt just as fragile and cracked as the cheap porcelain dishes she hand-washed every afternoon. Her true passions and her deepest dreams were securely locked away inside a freezing, tiny second-floor apartment just a few blocks down the street, gathering dust on blank canvases she could no longer afford to paint. Art school had long ago morphed into a distant, agonizing memory, hopelessly buried beneath a terrifying mountain of medical bills for her ailing mother and the crushing, relentless weight of her monthly rent in one of the most expensive cities in the United States. Her regular customers consisted of a highly predictable cast of local characters who provided a comforting, if monotonous, rhythm to her chaotic days. There was Frank, the burly construction foreman, working on the new high-rise down the block, who always read the sports section of the local newspaper and left exactly a $1 tip, regardless of how much his breakfast cost. There were the 2 gossiping legal secretaries from the corporate law firm across the street, who spent their entire lunch break ruthlessly dissecting their boss's miserable love life over wilted side salads and lukewarm tap water. And then, sitting quietly in the very back of the room, there was Mr. Michael Sterling. Mr. Sterling was entirely different from the rest of the loud, demanding patrons. He was not merely a regular customer in the traditional sense, but rather a permanent fixture, seemingly as much a part of the diner's structural foundation as the buzzing, flickering neon sign hanging outside the fogged front window. Every single morning, at precisely 7:15, he would push open the heavy glass door with considerable effort and slowly shuffle his way to table 4, the secluded corner booth located right next to the drafty back window. He never made eye contact with anyone, always wearing the exact same attire regardless of the harsh New England weather. A severely faded tweed jacket, meticulously ironed but threadbare trousers, and heavily scuffed leather shoes that had clearly seen decades of wear. His face was a complex, fascinating map of deep wrinkles, and his pale, watery blue eyes seemed to look straight through the bustling diner and into a distant, invisible world. He was a barely audible whisper in a remarkably loud and chaotic room, a man who seemed entirely content to fade into the background of a city that constantly demanded to be noticed. The very first time this mysterious elderly man had walked into the establishment, Mary's perpetually stressed boss, a heavy-set, sweaty man named Charlie, had pulled her aside to deliver a stern warning. He told her not to bother trying to make small talk with the grumpy old man at table 4, insisting that the customer never spoke a word to anyone, and only ever wanted a simple black coffee, alongside whatever the daily breakfast special happened to be. Charlie explained that the man always paid with exact change, never left a tip, and would leave as silently as he arrived, making any extra effort a complete waste of precious time. Brenda, the veteran waitress who possessed the notoriously short patience of an angry hornet, openly scoffed at his presence, loudly complaining that he was wasting a perfectly good 4-person booth and suggesting they should force him to sit at the counter. But when Mary looked at him, she saw something entirely different beneath his stoic, silent exterior. She saw a profound, aching loneliness and a quiet, steadfast dignity that deeply touched the sensitive, beating heart of the artist still alive inside of her. Choosing to completely ignore Charlie's cynical advice, Mary approached the silent man on his very first day with a warm, genuine smile and placed the laminated menu gently on the table in front of him. She cheerfully introduced herself, wishing him a good morning, and politely asking if she could start his day off right by bringing him a fresh cup of hot coffee to ward off the biting chill of the Boston morning. He offered no verbal response, merely uttering a low, non-committal grunt without ever bothering to lift his gaze from the scratched surface of the table. But she kindly served him the steaming beverage anyway. Later, when she brought out the daily special, consisting of a heavy, greasy plate of scrambled eggs and fried sausages, she keenly observed that his frail, aged hands trembled noticeably as he reached across the table to grab the salt shaker. The following day she repeated her cheerful greeting, and the day after that, continuing this completely one-sided ritual for an entire week, consistently meeting his stony silence with unwavering, persistent warmth. Then, on a particularly gloomy Monday morning, approximately 1 month into his silent, daily patronage, Mary noticed him visibly struggling to cut his tough, burnt toast, using one of the diner's notoriously dull butter knives. His knuckles were severely swollen and visibly inflamed with advanced arthritis, making the simple, everyday task an agonizing, frustrating ordeal for the proud older man. Without a second thought, and driven entirely by an instinctual surge of pure empathy, she stepped forward, gently took the knife from his trembling fingers, and softly asked him to allow her to help. She carefully sliced his toast into 4 perfect, easily manageable squares, and for the very first time, Mr. Sterling slowly looked up from his plate, allowing his watery blue eyes to finally meet hers in a moment of profound, unspoken connection. In that fleeting, beautiful second, she saw a distinct flash of genuine surprise, and perhaps even a flicker of deep, silent gratitude, before he gave a short, gruff nod and returned his attention to his meal, cementing a daily ritual that would secretly change both of their lives forever. That fateful Tuesday morning began exactly like any other miserable, gray day in the sprawling city of Boston, with the heavy, humid air thick with the distinct metallic smell of impending rain and the greasy aroma of sizzling bacon. Mary was barely functioning on a mere 4 hours of fragmented sleep, having spent the vast majority of her precious night trapped on the telephone with a remarkably unhelpful nurse from her mother's underfunded residential care facility. They had spent hours arguing over sudden, expensive changes to her mother's crucial medication regimen and the steadily mounting pile of overdue bills that threatened to result in a devastating eviction from the home. She felt the horribly familiar, icy knot of pure financial anxiety tightening violently in the pit of her empty stomach, but she bravely shoved the feeling down, securely pinning her bright, professional waitress smile firmly into place as she tied her faded, stained apron around her waist. The battered clock on the diner wall slowly ticked past 7:15, and then 7:20, yet the worn, mustard-colored vinyl of Table 4 remained completely empty, a glaring, highly unusual absence in her rigidly structured morning routine. Mary nervously glanced at the clock, then stared intensely at the fogged front door, a small, worried crease forming on her forehead as she absent-mindedly wiped down the counter for the 3rd consecutive time. Mr. Sterling was absolutely never late. He was famously, undeniably as reliable as the rising sun, a comforting constant in a chaotic world that otherwise offered her absolutely zero stability or predictability. By the time 7:30 finally rolled around, a cold, creeping trickle of genuine, deep-seated concern began to actively infiltrate her racing thoughts, making her wonder if the frail elderly man had taken a terrible fall or suddenly fallen deathly ill, alone in his apartment. She made a quiet mental note to gently interrogate the other regular customers to see if anyone somehow knew where the isolated man lived, even though she severely doubted a single soul in the establishment knew anything beyond his daily breakfast order. At precisely 5 minutes past 8 o'clock, the rusty bell above the diner's front door finally let out a sharp, metallic clink. But the person who stepped out of the pouring rain was most certainly not the frail Mr. Sterling. The entire diner fell into an immediate, absolute silence. Even the relentless, aggressive sizzling of Charlie's greasy, flat-top grill seemed to miraculously quiet down in the presence of the incredibly intimidating new arrivals. 4 massive men, all built like industrial refrigerators and dressed impeccably in flawless, tailored black suits, with coiled earpieces trailing down their thick necks, stepped inside the cramped restaurant, moving with a fluid, highly disciplined precision that felt completely alien in this sticky, imperfect environment. 2 of the imposing giants immediately flanked the front door, their cold, calculating eyes sweeping over the terrified customers with an unsettling, predatory stillness, while the other 2 stepped aside to respectfully clear a path for a 5th, vastly different man to enter. This 5th man was older, perhaps somewhere in his late 60s, sporting perfectly slicked-back silver hair that receded from a high, aristocratic forehead, and a sharp, angular face dominated by incredibly intelligent, piercing gray eyes. He was wearing a stunning, charcoal gray bespoke suit that undoubtedly cost significantly more money than Mary could ever hope to earn in an entire year of agonizing, back-breaking labor at the diner, and in his manicured hand, he carried a pristine, slim leather briefcase. He slowly looked around the dingy, smoke-filled diner, his refined expression projecting a highly calculated mixture of mild, aristocratic disgust and intense, unwavering focus as he searched for his intended target among the frozen patrons. Charlie, desperately wiping his greasy hands on his dirty apron, nervously asked if he could help the gentleman, his usual abrasive arrogance completely vanishing in the face of such overwhelming, undeniable wealth and raw, unadulterated power. The sharply dressed man completely ignored Charlie's stammering inquiry, letting his piercing gaze sweep across the silent room until it finally landed directly on Mary, who was standing frozen near the ancient coffee machine with a half-full glass pot trembling in her hand. He walked purposefully straight toward her, his incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes making soft, decisive, muffled sounds against the sticky linoleum floor, while the 2 massive bodyguards followed closely behind, their sheer physical presence seemingly sucking all the breathable oxygen straight out of the cramped room. Stopping just a few feet away from the counter, the man calmly asked if she was Miss Mary Collins, his deep, resonant voice carrying an undeniable, heavy authority that practically demanded immediate, total compliance. Mary's heart hammered violently against her ribs like a trapped bird, and finding her throat completely devoid of moisture, she could only manage a slow, terrified nod, desperately wondering if this sudden nightmare was somehow related to her mother's massive unpaid medical debts. The man offered her a long, highly analytical look, before smoothly introducing himself as Mr. Mitchell, the senior managing partner of the highly prestigious law firm of Sterling, Carter and Mitchell, and the exclusive personal attorney to the late Mr. Michael Sterling. The name hung heavily in the stale, greasy air of the diner, sounding so incredibly formal, so vastly important, that it took Mary a long, confusing moment to finally connect this grand title to the quiet, fragile old man who sat in the drafty corner booth. When Mr. Mitchell gently informed her that Mr. Sterling had passed away peacefully in his sleep the previous night, the glass coffee pot suddenly felt impossibly heavy in Mary's shaking hand, and a massive, completely unexpected wave of pure, crushing sorrow washed over her. She barely knew the man, yet tears violently pricked the back of her eyes as Mr. Mitchell firmly instructed her to gather her belongings immediately. explaining that Mr. Sterling's final will contained a very specific, highly unusual provision that legally required her immediate presence at the official reading. The subsequent ride to the prestigious law firm was a completely silent, deeply surreal journey through the bustling, rain-slicked streets of Boston, leaving Mary feeling as though she had been suddenly abducted by benevolent, wealthy aliens. She sat nervously in the cavernous back seat of the elegant, black Mercedes town car, staring blankly out through the heavily tinted windows at the highly familiar city streets, which now felt incredibly distant, cold, and entirely alien to her current, bizarre reality. The luxurious vehicle was a quiet, insulated oasis of extreme wealth, smelling intoxicatingly of expensive conditioned leather, subtle designer cologne, and premium car polish, shielding her completely from the harsh, noisy reality of the working-class life she had left behind at the diner. Sitting directly across from her, Mr. Mitchell spent the entire duration of the ride meticulously reviewing thick stacks of legal documents retrieved from his pristine briefcase, his aging face locked into a completely unreadable, rigid mask of absolute, unwavering professionalism. The corporate offices of Sterling, Carter, and Mitchell were located on the sprawling penthouse floor of a massive, gleaming glass skyscraper situated in the very heart of Boston's incredibly wealthy financial district, a literal and figurative world away from the gritty, working-class reality of the Dawn Diner. Upon stepping out of the private elevator, Mary was immediately greeted by vast expanses of flawless imported marble floors, towering floor-to-ceiling glass walls, offering breathtaking panoramic views of the stormy city skyline, and remarkably quiet, heavily carpeted corridors lined with museum-quality pieces of modern art. Wearing her faded, culturally distressed blue jeans and heavily scuffed, cheap canvas sneakers, Mary felt exactly like a frightened, mangy stray cat that had somehow accidentally wandered into a pristine, heavily guarded royal palace. She was quickly escorted by the silent, looming bodyguards into a massive, intimidating boardroom, entirely dominated by an incredibly long, highly polished mahogany conference table that looked like it belonged in the United Nations headquarters rather than a local law firm. Seated impatiently at the far end of the impossibly long table were two exceedingly well-dressed individuals who aggressively radiated a highly toxic, suffocating aura of extreme, unearned privilege and deep, simmering resentment. The younger man appeared to be in his late 20s, sporting aggressively slicked-back dark hair, a flashy, ostentatious designer suit that looked just slightly too tight across the shoulders, and a deeply petulant, arrogant sneer permanently plastered across his handsome face. The elegant woman sitting directly beside him, who Mary accurately presumed to be his mother, was impeccably dressed in a conservative but clearly priceless ensemble, her severely tight face forming a carefully constructed, flawless mask of polite, icy disdain as her manicured fingers drummed furiously against the wood. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat loudly as they entered the tense room, formally introducing Diane Sterling and her arrogant son Richard Sterling to Mary, whose stomach immediately plummeted as Richard's cruel, sweeping gaze took in her cheap, stained clothing with profound, unconcealed disgust. Richard let out a harsh, cruel laugh, openly mocking the fact that they had been forced to sit and wait for a lowly diner waitress to arrive, loudly proclaiming to his mother that his deceased grandfather had clearly lost his mind in his final pathetic days. Diane offered a sharp, albeit entirely emotionless reprimand to her son, demanding he behave himself, though the freezing, calculating glare she subsequently directed at Mary was equally hostile and deeply unwelcoming, making the poor waitress feel incredibly small and entirely out of place. Mr. Mitchell completely ignored the family's toxic, arrogant posturing, politely directing Mary to sit in a plush leather chair situated as far away from the hostile Sterlings as physically possible, creating a vast, intentional physical chasm between their two vastly different, fiercely colliding worlds. Taking his place at the head of the massive table, Mr. Mitchell opened a remarkably thick, leather-bound document, carefully adjusted his reading glasses, and officially announced that the formal reading of the primary codicil would now commence, plunging the room into absolute silence. The attorney began reading in a dry, monotonous, highly practiced tone, unleashing a massive, confusing flood of dense legal jargon, complex corporate trusts, and massive charitable donations that flew entirely over Mary's thoroughly overwhelmed and wildly spinning head. She sat frozen, listening in pure shock, as astronomical, practically unimaginable sums of money were casually tossed around, quickly realizing that the fragile old man she had quietly served eggs and burnt toast to was actually in possession of an incredibly vast, almost limitless fortune. Eventually, Mr. Mitchell paused, looking directly at the deeply impatient mother and son duo, and formally announced that according to a pre-existing, legally binding family trust agreement, Diane and Richard were to each receive exactly $10 million, a massive sum that somehow caused Richard to immediately explode with pure rage. The young man furiously slammed his fists against the polished mahogany, violently shouting that $10 million was an absolute insult, completely unacceptable given that the global holding company was worth billions, prompting Mr. Mitchell to coldly remind him that his grandfather had deliberately liquidated the vast majority of his personal assets. Continuing without missing a single beat, Mr. Mitchell read off a handsome bequest of exactly $1 million to the deceased's personal physician, Dr. Albert Foster, before finally pausing, taking a deep breath, and turning his piercing gray eyes directly toward the terrified, confused waitress sitting at the end of the table. He announced that they had finally reached the ultimate, completely irrevocable disposition of the estate, reading Mr. Sterling's exact words, which specifically praised Miss Mary Collins, the kind young woman from the Dawn Diner who had consistently shown dignity and compassion to a lonely, broken old man. The will specifically detailed how she had, without fail, cut his toast into 4 equal squares every single morning because she had noticed his hands trembling, a profoundly mundane yet incredibly touching observation that brought hot, heavy tears streaming down Mary's stunned face. Mr. Mitchell then formally declared that Mary was to immediately inherit the sum of $250,000 to permanently relieve her personal burdens, as well as the absolute, total ownership of the Dawn Diner property and an attached commercial investment portfolio, currently valued at exactly $5 million. Leaving the suffocating, incredibly tense atmosphere of the law office felt exactly like stepping out of a highly pressurized, completely isolated hyperbaric chamber directly into the violently spinning eye of a Category 5 hurricane. The massive, stone-faced bodyguards were forced to physically surround Mary and heavily escort her back to the waiting Mercedes, physically shielding her from the violently furious, practically rabid verbal assaults of Richard Sterling, who had aggressively chased them all the way out into the marbled hallway. He was practically foaming at the mouth, his handsome face contorted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage, screaming at the top of his lungs that she was a filthy gold digger and promising to hire a massive army of vicious lawyers to contest every single inch of the ridiculous will. Mary remained completely silent, trapped in a state of profound, overwhelming shock, her exhausted, racing mind endlessly, numbly repeating the completely unbelievable, life-altering words the attorney had just spoken, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of owning $5 million and a commercial business. Before parting ways, Mr. Mitchell gently handed her his personal platinum business card and a remarkably thick, heavy folder, practically bursting with highly sensitive legal documents, softly instructing her not to speak to a single soul, especially the hostile Sterling family, and promising that a dedicated financial advisor would contact her early the next morning. The luxurious black town car eventually dropped her off directly in front of her dilapidated, crumbling apartment building, creating a deeply jarring, practically comical visual contrast between the multi-million-dollar vehicle and the trash-strewn, severely cracked pavement of her impoverished neighborhood. The very first thing she did upon locking the flimsy door to her tiny apartment was to pick up her outdated, cracked cell phone, call the financial administrator at her mother's care facility, and confidently, tearfully pay off the entire outstanding medical balance using the immediate, emergency funds Mr. Mitchell had wired her. She then aggressively prepaid for the next 2 entire years of care, demanding a private room and the absolute best medical attention available, and the resulting, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated relief brought her completely to her knees, sobbing violently on her dusty floor. The next morning, Mary simply could not bring herself to show up for her scheduled shift at the diner, absolutely terrified of facing her co-workers and having absolutely no idea how to explain the completely absurd, reality-shattering events of the previous, chaotic 24 hours. Instead, she spent the morning visiting a high-end local bank to officially establish her massive new accounts, watching with immense, quiet amusement as the deeply arrogant bank manager, who had previously treated her with sheer, dismissive contempt, suddenly practically bowed to her, treating her with profound, sycophantic respect. By the time the early afternoon rolled around, she knew she could not hide in her tiny apartment forever. She had to bravely face the music, so she took a deep, steadying breath and slowly walked the incredibly familiar, rain-washed blocks toward the glowing neon sign of the Dawn Diner. It was the absolute peak of the notoriously chaotic, high-stress lunch rush, but the very moment she pushed open the heavy front door and the rusty bell let out its familiar metallic clink, every single head in the packed room whipped around, and the deafening noise completely vanished. Charlie slowly looked up from his greasy flat-top grill, his favorite battered metal spatula firmly clutched in his sweaty hand, while Brenda, who was precariously balancing a massive, heavy tray loaded with towering burgers, completely froze mid-step, her jaw practically hitting the sticky floor. The rampant, highly exaggerated gossip from Frank the construction worker, who had eagerly witnessed her dramatic, incredibly suspicious departure with the men in black suits, must have aggressively spread through the tight-knit local community like a terrifying, uncontrollable wildfire. Walking confidently right up to the front counter, Mary calmly confirmed all of the wild, swirling rumors, explicitly stating that Mr. Michael Sterling had indeed left her a significant amount of money, and much more shockingly, he had also left her full, total ownership of the diner. A massive, collective gasp violently ripped through the stunned, frozen staff, and Charlie actually dropped his spatula directly onto the sizzling, smoking grill, stammering in absolute disbelief that he had proudly owned and operated the establishment for exactly 30 years. Mary reached into her bag, pulling out a crisp legal document, and gently explained to the terrified cook that according to the official corporate records, he had secretly sold the property over 6 months ago to a massive shell corporation known as Sterling Holdings. Charlie aggressively sank down onto a wobbly vinyl stool, his sweaty face draining of all color, looking completely and utterly defeated, as he confessed that the mysterious holding company had offered him a massive, absolutely undeniable fortune, leading him to believe the diner would eventually be completely demolished. Brenda immediately let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh, aggressively throwing her heavy tray down onto the counter with a loud bang, and angrily challenged Mary, sneeringly asking if the new wealthy boss was going to immediately fire all of her former friends to hire fancy new staff. It was her very first genuine test of leadership, and feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of their intense resentment and raw fear, Mary took a deep breath, channeled Mr. Sterling's quiet, unshakable dignity, and firmly declared that absolutely nobody was getting fired. She looked directly into the deeply terrified eyes of her former co-workers and spoke with a surprisingly clear, authoritative voice, publicly praising Charlie as the absolute best grill cook in the entire city, and commending Brenda for her unmatched, incredible ability to handle 6 tables simultaneously during a massive rush. She honestly admitted that she knew absolutely nothing about running a commercial business and would desperately need their continued vital help, promising that the only major changes she would immediately make would be buying a brand new espresso machine, sharpening all the dull knives, and finally fixing the broken air conditioning. This highly practical, incredibly grounded promise instantly shattered the thick, toxic tension in the room, causing several of the kitchen staff to let out genuine, relieved laughs, instantly earning the young woman a small, highly crucial sliver of true respect from the hardened, cynical crew. For the next several weeks, Mary spent her exhausting days humbly learning the diner's operations alongside her friends, and her long nights locked inside Mr. Sterling's luxurious penthouse office, aggressively studying complex business strategies with Mr. Mitchell to prepare for the looming, inevitable war with the vengeful Sterling family. The massive, sprawling corporate empire of Sterling Global Holdings was completely vulnerable, and Richard Sterling was aggressively, ruthlessly moving all of his highly corrupt, incredibly wealthy allies into key positions to completely seize total, unquestioned control of the massive company. Sitting in the dimly lit, incredibly quiet penthouse office late one Thursday night, Mr. Mitchell carefully laid out the terrifying, highly complex reality of the situation to Mary, pointing to a massive, intricate corkboard covered in confusing corporate structures, stock percentages, and hostile takeover strategies. He explained that Richard fundamentally lacked the personal financial capital to buy the company outright, so the arrogant young man was intentionally trying to cause massive internal chaos, deliberately aiming to terrify the institutional investors and aggressively drive down the current stock price. His ultimate, incredibly destructive goal was to force an emergency vote of no confidence against the current, highly competent Chief Executive Officer, George Roberts, and subsequently install himself as the undisputed chairman of the board, even if it meant entirely burning his grandfather's legacy to the ground. Mary stared intensely at the highly confusing board, feeling incredibly small and entirely out of her depth, before quietly asking the veteran lawyer exactly how a former diner waitress was supposed to stop a billionaire heir from successfully executing a hostile corporate takeover. Mr. Mitchell offered a small, incredibly rare smile, slowly reaching into his leather briefcase to produce a single, beautifully ornate, gold-embossed stock certificate, gently sliding it across the polished mahogany desk until it rested directly in front of her widened, unbelieving eyes. He explained that Mr. Sterling had deliberately, secretly transferred exactly one single voting share of the parent company directly into her name, legally granting her the absolute, undeniable right to physically enter the boardroom and speak directly to the assembled shareholders at the upcoming annual meeting. They absolutely could not beat Richard in a simple financial bidding war, but working tirelessly through the night, the unlikely duo aggressively formulated a brilliant, incredibly audacious plan that relied entirely on Mary's unique ability to appeal directly to the humanity of the greedy board members. When the highly anticipated morning of the annual shareholder meeting finally arrived, Mary stood perfectly still in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in the luxurious penthouse bedroom, staring at a completely transformed, deeply confident version of her former self. Thanks to the absolute insistence of Mr. Mitchell, she was not wearing her usual cheap, highly distressed thrift store clothing. Instead, she was impeccably dressed in a stunning, perfectly tailored navy blue designer suit that practically screamed quiet, understated authority and immense, old money wealth. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and while her exterior projected absolute, unbreakable calm, internally, her racing heart was frantically beating against her ribs like a terrified, trapped bird, desperately trying to escape its incredibly expensive, restrictive cage. Flanked by two massive, highly intimidating private security guards, she bravely walked through the gleaming, towering glass lobby of the Sterling Global Tower, her expensive leather heels clicking loudly, rhythmically against the pristine marble floor, completely ready to face the absolute biggest, most terrifying challenge of her life. She spotted Richard Sterling standing near the private executive elevators, loudly laughing with a large group of highly arrogant, incredibly wealthy board members, aggressively exuding a deeply toxic, suffocating aura of unearned confidence and pure, unadulterated entitlement. The very moment he spotted her walking toward the elevators, his handsome face violently contorted, rapidly shifting from genuine, profound shock to a mask of highly exaggerated, incredibly cruel amusement, loudly mocking her presence for the entire crowded lobby to hear. He mockingly asked if the lowly waitress had gotten lost and come to serve the executives their morning coffee, prompting a chorus of cruel, sycophantic laughter from his loyal cronies. But Mary absolutely refused to take the incredibly obvious, highly insulting bait. She stopped directly in front of him, meeting his cruel, mocking gaze with an expression of absolute unbreakable stone, calmly informing him in a clear, ringing voice that she was a legally recognized shareholder with the absolute right to be there, leaving him utterly speechless as she stepped onto the elevator. The massive, incredibly intimidating corporate boardroom was a literal amphitheater of immense, suffocating power, completely dominated by an enormous U-shaped mahogany table, filled with aggressive, highly successful men and women wearing incredibly expensive suits and extremely severe, calculating expressions. Several rows of plush velvet chairs positioned directly behind the main table were packed tightly with major institutional investors, highly critical financial analysts, and eager members of the press, creating an atmosphere so incredibly tense and heavy that it was practically suffocating. Guided gently by the reassuring presence of Mr. Mitchell, Mary calmly took a highly prominent seat in the very front row, specifically reserved for vocal shareholders, instantly feeling hundreds of highly critical, questioning eyes burning fiercely into the back of her neck. The meeting officially commenced with a series of incredibly dry, remarkably boring financial presentations and tedious quarterly reports, and Mary forced herself to sit perfectly still, listening intently with her trembling hands tightly clasped together in her lap to hide her overwhelming nerves. Finally, the current chairman officially opened the floor for new corporate business, and Richard Sterling immediately leaped to his feet, instantly proving himself to be a highly natural, incredibly charismatic public speaker as he passionately addressed the massive, utterly silent room. He spoke aggressively and eloquently about his family's grand historical legacy, passionately outlining a bold, highly aggressive new vision for the future, and deliberately painting the current, highly stable leadership as dangerously stagnant, completely unimaginative, and entirely unfit for the modern era. His powerful, booming voice practically echoed off the glass walls as he loudly demanded a formal vote of no confidence in the current CEO, officially nominating himself to immediately take over the position to lead the massive corporation back to its former glory. As murmurs of strong, undeniable support rippled through the massive room, the chairman slowly looked around, asking if any other shareholder wished to speak on the incredibly serious motion before proceeding to the final vote, setting the stage for Mary's ultimate, highly anticipated move. With a small, silent, highly encouraging nod from Mr. Mitchell, Mary slowly, deliberately stood up from her chair, causing a massive, immediate wave of highly confused, frantic whispers to violently ripple through the densely packed audience of wealthy executives. Richard aggressively sneered, gripping his expensive microphone, and loudly, condescendingly informed the chairman that the floor was strictly reserved for actual corporate shareholders, not for the lost, wandering members of the building's catering staff, desperately trying to publicly humiliate her. Mary confidently pressed the button on her own microphone, her voice trembling just slightly for a fraction of a second, before she rapidly found her inner strength, clearly stating her full name, and proudly confirming her completely legal status as a recognized shareholder. She deliberately turned away from the furious Richard, boldly looking directly into the incredibly surprised, highly attentive faces of the powerful board members and wealthy investors, confidently declaring that she was there to speak about the true, highly personal legacy of the late Mr. Michael Sterling. She did not speak about massive billion-dollar corporate acquisitions or highly aggressive hostile takeovers. Instead, she spoke incredibly softly and honestly about the humble Dawn Diner, capturing the entire room's attention with a deeply moving, highly unexpected story of simple human dignity. She beautifully described the completely silent, incredibly frail old man who sat alone at table 4, explaining to the powerful executives how she had noticed his aged, arthritic hands shaking so violently that he could not even properly slice his own breakfast toast. The massive, initially dismissive room fell entirely silent, captivated by the raw, unadulterated humanity of the story, as Mary passionately explained that in his final, fading years, the legendary corporate titan was not actively seeking extreme wealth, but rather basic, simple human kindness. She masterfully painted a deeply intimate, highly vulnerable portrait of a lonely man who had possessed absolute, total power over billions of dollars, yet found his only true, genuine peace in the quiet, completely unrecognized compassion of a struggling, exhausted waitress. Suddenly shifting her tone to one of absolute, unyielding authority, she violently turned her attention back to the deeply enraged Richard, publicly challenging his highly aggressive, so-called bold vision for the future of the massive corporation by utilizing the undeniable, documented truth. With Mr. Mitchell simultaneously distributing thick, undeniable folders of hard evidence to the board, Mary loudly, flawlessly exposed Richard's highly reckless, disastrous financial history, directly citing Mr. Sterling's incredibly private, handwritten journals that she now legally possessed. She boldly revealed to the completely shocked room that Richard's vaunted vision had previously resulted in a massive, catastrophic loss of exactly $30 million in a completely failed technology venture, and that his grandfather had been secretly forced to pay over $2 million to settle his disgusting gambling debts. She read directly from the late founder's own diary, quoting his exact, devastating words that his grandson possessed the blind ambition of a king, but the pathetic, reckless judgment of a fool, effectively destroying Richard's entire, carefully constructed public credibility in a matter of seconds. Mary refused to attack Richard directly, and instead praised George Roberts for his caution, stability, and loyalty, connecting his leadership to Mr. Sterling's final wishes. She proposed creating the Sterling Legacy Foundation, funded by 10% of the company's annual profits, to support small businesses and provide scholarships for the underprivileged. She offered to lead the foundation without pay to preserve the founder's true vision. After a moment of silence, the board erupted into applause, with investors, analysts, and even Richard's supporters moved by her strategy. Richard was left defeated, as his hostile takeover attempt was overwhelmingly rejected, while Mary's proposal was unanimously approved. Months later, the Dawn Diner was renovated, though the old table where Mary once showed kindness remained preserved as a symbol of the past. Mary balanced running the successful restaurant with directing the foundation, proving that true wealth is not measured by money or power, but by the positive impact we create. Her journey showed that a simple act of compassion can change lives, and that genuine human connection is the one treasure money can never buy.